My family has lived deep in the Ozarks for generations, a good hour's drive on dirt roads from the nearest town. We were self-sufficient, and that meant raising our own livestock. For as long as I can remember, we had a pig pen out past the tree line where we'd raise a sounder of hogs for slaughter each winter. When I was 14, my dad brought home a new litter. One of them was a runt, but he had these weirdly intelligent, almost black eyes. My sister named him Tom. Most pigs are just pigs. They eat, they sleep, they squeal. But old Tom was different from the start. He'd watch us, not just look in our direction, but actually watch us, his head cocked to the side as if he was processing what we were doing, learning our routines. When Dad would slop the hogs, the others would rush the trough in a chaotic mob. Tom would hang back, wait for an opening, and then methodically push the weaker ones aside. It was calculated. It was unnerving. We'd all laugh it off, calling him the Professor Pig, but deep down, a cold knot would tighten in my stomach whenever he'd stop what he was doing and just stare at me from across the muddy pen, his gaze unwavering and unsettlingly human. As Tom grew, he became the undisputed king of the pen. He wasn't just the biggest, he was the most cunning. We had to reinforce the fence twice because he learned how to systematically worry the posts, nudging and pushing at the same spot for hours until the wood splintered. The other pigs started acting like him, becoming more aggressive, more organized. They weren't just a herd anymore. They were his gang. The change was most obvious in their sounds. Before Tom, the pen was filled with mindless grunts and squeals. After he took over, there were these low, guttural rumbles, almost like a form of communication that would pass between them whenever we approached. My dad, a man who feared nothing, started carrying a heavy hickory stick with him just to go feed them. One evening, he saw Tom corner one of the smaller sows, not for food or dominance, but seemingly for cruelty. He was backing her into a corner, his massive head lowered, while the others formed a semicircle, watching. When Dad cracked the stick against the fence to break it up, Tom didn't startle or run. He slowly turned his head, looked my dad dead in the eyes, and let out a low, menacing roar that didn't sound like any pig I'd ever heard. It was a threat.
The week before the first snow, Dad decided it was time. The air had a sharp, metallic bite to it, and we needed to stock the smokehouse. That morning, the pigs were quiet, eerily quiet. Usually they'd be raising hell, knowing it was feeding time. Instead, they were all clustered at the far end of the pen, with Tom in the middle, facing the gate. It was like they were waiting. Dad grabbed his rifle and the slaughtering tools, telling me to stay on the porch. "Something ain't right with them today," he muttered, his brow furrowed. He walked to the pen, unlatched the gate, and stepped inside. For a second, nothing happened. The world was still and silent. Then Tom let out that same terrifying roar from before, and it was like a dam breaking. The entire sounder, all 20 of them, charged my father in a single unified waves. He didn't even have time to raise his rifle. It wasn't a frenzy. It was an organized, tactical assault. They swarmed him, a tide of pink and brown flesh, and he just disappeared beneath them. The sounds they made were not of hunger, but of pure, unadulterated rage. I was frozen on the porch, a scream trapped in my throat. I saw the flash of my father's red flannel shirt, then it was gone. All I could hear were his muffled, agonized screams, mixed with the horrific wet, tearing sounds and the triumphant, blood-curdling squeals of the hogs. Then the screaming stopped. Old Tom, his snout and tusks dripping with crimson, lifted his head from the fray and looked directly at the house. He looked right at me. He let out another command, another one of those guttural roars, and the pack disengaged from what was left of my father and turned their attention toward the house. They began to move as one, a single-minded killing machine, straight for the porch where I stood. I finally found my legs, scrambled inside, and slammed the heavy oak door shut, just as the first massive body slammed against it. The wood groaned, and I could hear their snouts snuffling and pushing at the bottom, their tusks scraping against the timber, trying to find a way in. They were hunting us. They were trying to finish the job.
My mother, who had seen the whole thing from the kitchen window, was a statue of silent shock for a moment before her survival instinct kicked in. She shoved me away from the door and slid the heavy iron deadbolt into place. The pigs were ramming the door in unison now, the entire house shaking with each impact. Splinters of wood flew into the room from the door jamb. Mom grabbed the old 12-gauge from above the mantel, her hands shaking so badly she could barely break it open to check the shells. The scraping sound at the door was joined by a new sound, the shattering of the living room window. A pig was trying to climb through, its front hooves scrabbling against the wall. Mom didn't hesitate. She swung the shotgun around and fired. The blast was deafening in the small room, and the pig shrieked and fell back outside. But the others didn't stop. They were relentless, driven by a hatred I couldn't comprehend, orchestrated by the monster we had raised from a runt. We spent the next hour in a living nightmare, huddled in the back bedroom, listening to the pigs methodically trying to destroy our home. They rammed the walls, broke every ground floor window, and tore the siding off with their teeth. The sounds of their fury were constant. Finally, as dusk settled, the sounds began to fade. They were giving up, or so we thought. When the state troopers finally arrived, our nearest neighbor had heard the shotgun blast and called them. They found a scene from hell. The pig pen was empty. The yard was a churned-up mess of mud and blood. What was left of my father was barely recognizable. Of the 20 pigs, they only ever found a few, shot and scattered in the woods. But they never found old Tom. The official report called it a freak animal attack, but I know what it was. It was an execution. I still have nightmares about his eyes, those intelligent, hateful eyes. We sold the farm and moved away, but you never really leave a place like that behind. It follows you. The memory of the sounds and the sight of that pig, our pig, leading the charge against the man who fed it.
My husband, Ben, and I bought our dream cabin as an escape. We were tired of the city, of the noise, of the people. We wanted solitude, the kind you can only find in a place like the Cabinet Mountains of Montana. The nearest neighbor was 5 miles down a barely there logging road. For the first few months, it was perfect. The silence was a balm. We'd sit on the porch and watch the sunset paint the peaks in shades of orange and purple. But as winter began to set in, the silence changed. It became heavier, more watchful. It started with the feeling of being watched when I'd be outside gathering firewood.
Then came the howls, not the lonely, distant howls you hear in movies, but a chorus of them, and they were close, too close. One evening, Ben saw them for the first time, a pack of wolves, standing like statues at the edge of our clearing, just beyond the reach of the porch light. They weren't just passing through, they were observing us. At the head of the pack was an enormous male, dark as coal, with unnervingly pale yellow eyes. He was the one who held my gaze, and there was no fear in him, only a cold, patient intelligence. They started testing us. At first it was subtle things. We'd find their tracks in the morning, right up to the steps of the cabin. Our dog, a brave golden retriever named Cooper, would spend the nights pacing anxiously by the door, a low growl rumbling in his chest. Ben tried firing a warning shot from his hunting rifle into the air one night. The pack melted back into the shadows of the pines without a sound, but the next evening they were back, in the exact same spot, as if nothing had happened. They were not afraid of us. They were studying our defenses, our routines, our vulnerabilities. The sense of isolation we had craved now felt like a trap. The beautiful wilderness that surrounded us had transformed into a cage, and we were the ones on display. The alpha, the big black one, seemed to be orchestrating it all. He would sit perfectly still while the others moved around, probing the edges of our small territory. It felt personal. It felt like we had trespassed on their land, and they were slowly, methodically, deciding on our punishment.
The turning point came one Tuesday. Ben had to drive into town for supplies, a trip that took the better part of the day. I stayed behind with Cooper. Around noon, an unsettling quiet fell over the woods. Cooper, who was usually by my side, started barking frantically from the back of the cabin. I ran to the window and saw him, hackles raised, at the far end of the clearing, barking at the dense tree line. And then I saw the alpha. He stepped out of the woods, silent as a ghost. He wasn't looking at me. He was looking at Cooper. It wasn't a hunt. It was a challenge. Before I could even scream for Cooper to come back, two other wolves flanked out from the trees, cutting off his path to the cabin. It was a coordinated ambush. The alpha lunged, and it was over in a matter of seconds. They didn't even eat him. They just killed him, brutally and efficiently, and then dragged his body back into the forest. It was a message, a clear and terrifying escalation. When Ben got home and I told him what happened, the color drained from his face. We weren't just being watched anymore. We were being besieged. That night, the siege began in earnest. A blizzard had moved in, cutting us off completely. The snow was coming down so thick you couldn't see 10 feet. The phone line was dead. The wolves, emboldened by the storm and their victory that afternoon, closed in. We could hear them circling the cabin, their claws making scratching sounds on the frozen porch boards. A heavy thud against the wall would jolt us out of our skin, followed by a chorus of snarling. They were throwing themselves against the cabin, testing for any weak point. Ben and I stood in the dark, him with the rifle, me with a heavy fireplace poker, our hearts pounding in sync with the howling wind and the scratching of the claws outside. We pushed the heavy furniture against the doors and windows, creating a makeshift fortress. But the cabin, which once felt so sturdy and safe, now felt like a flimsy wooden box about to be torn apart by the storm and the monsters it concealed. The terror was suffocating, made worse by the fact that we couldn't see them, only hear them, their presence a suffocating weight on all sides.
The attack came at the weakest point, a small bathroom window that we hadn't been able to barricade properly. The sound of shattering glass was like a gunshot in the tense silence. A wolf, not the alpha, but another large gray one, was halfway through the frame, snarling and snapping, its hot breath fogging in the frigid air. Then fired without aiming, the rifle's blast echoing like a cannon inside the small house. The wolf yelped and fell back, but the breach was made. Now they knew they could get in. More bodies slammed against the broken window frame, each one trying to force its way through the opening. Ben fired again. The smell of gunpowder and blood filled the air. He looked at me, his face pale and grim in the darkness. "They aren't going to stop," he said, his voice terrifyingly calm. "They'll keep coming until they get in." He knew and I knew that we couldn't hold them off all night. We had maybe a dozen rounds left. They had endless patience and ferocity. We were trapped and our time was running out. Ben made a decision that will haunt me for the rest of my life. He grabbed my arm, his eyes locking onto mine. "Take the emergency radio, go to the root cellar, bar the door from the inside, and don't come out. No matter what you hear, you don't come out." He was going to make a run for the generator shed, to try and power the radio and call for help. It was suicide. We both knew it. I started to argue, to cry, but he put a finger to my lips. "I have to give you a chance," he whispered, kissing my forehead. "I love you." He unbarred the front door, took a deep breath, and ran out into the swirling snow and the darkness, firing the rifle as he went. I heard the pack roar, a sound of fury and triumph. I heard Ben scream. I scrambled into the root cellar, slammed the heavy door, and slid the iron bolt home just as he had told me. Then I just sat there in the cold, damp darkness, listening to the horrifying sounds from above as the pack tore my husband apart. The sounds went on for a very long time.
A search and rescue team found me the next morning, alerted by our neighbor, who was worried when our road wasn't plowed. The scene outside the cabin was something out of a nightmare. The snow was red. They found pieces of Ben's rifle and his shredded coat. They never found most of him. The official story was that we were victims of an unusually aggressive and starving wolf pack, driven to desperation by a hard winter. But I know it wasn't just hunger. I saw the intelligence in that alpha's eyes. It was a strategic, relentless campaign to eradicate us from their territory. I sold the cabin and moved to a city so big and loud you can't even see the stars at night. I need the noise. I need the lights. Because in the silence, in the darkness, I can still hear the scratching at the door, and I can still see those pale yellow eyes watching me from the edge of the trees.
I used to think of the forest as my sanctuary. I'm a landscape photographer, and for me, the deep, ancient heart of the Appalachian Mountains in North Carolina was my church. I was experienced, meticulous. I knew the rules: make noise, carry bear spray, store food properly. I respected the wilderness. I never feared it. That changed during a solo trip one October. I was deep in the Pisgah National Forest, chasing the last of the autumn colors. The air was crisp, the light was golden, and the solitude was total. On my second day out, I saw him. A black bear, but bigger than any I had ever seen on the East Coast. He was easily over 500 pounds, a great hulking shadow of muscle and fur, foraging on the other side of a clearing. I did what you're supposed to do. I made myself big, clapped my hands, and yelled, "Hey, bear!" He lifted his massive head, looked at me for a long moment with an unnerving lack of concern, and then ambled back into the dense rhododendron thicket. I felt a thrill, not of fear, but of awe. I had seen the king of this forest. I had no idea that the king had also seen me, and that our encounter wasn't over. The next day, the entire mood of the forest had shifted. The usual chatter of birds and squirrels was gone. The woods were wrapped in a profound, heavy silence that felt predatory. A primal instinct, something deep in my hindbrain, was screaming at me that I was being hunted. I kept stopping, scanning the trees, feeling the hairs on my neck stand up. Then I saw the tracks. The same huge paw prints from the day before, but this time they were pressed into the mud on top of my own boot prints from earlier that morning. He hadn't just wandered off, he had circled back. He was stalking me. The awe I had felt was replaced by a cold, liquid dread that filled my veins. This wasn't a chance encounter anymore. This was a pursuit. I quickened my pace, my heart hammering against my ribs, my hand gripping the can of bear spray so tightly my knuckles were white. The sanctuary had become a labyrinth, and I was being stalked by its resident minotaur. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig sent a jolt of pure adrenaline through my system. The bear was out there, somewhere in the shadows, watching, waiting.
The attack was an explosion of violence. There was no roar, no warning charge from a distance. One moment, I was pushing through a thicket of mountain laurel. The next, he was just there. He burst from the undergrowth not 10 feet away, a silent black nightmare moving with impossible speed. I fumbled with the bear spray, yanking the safety clip off, but I was too slow. He closed the distance in 2 massive bounds and slammed into me like a freight train. The impact sent me flying, and the world became a chaotic blur of pain and terror. The first thing I remember is the sound, a sickening, wet crunch, which I later realized was my own shoulder shattering under his weight. He was on top of me, his immense bulk crushing the air from my lungs. I could smell his breath, a hot, rank odor of rot and earth. I saw his teeth, long and yellowed, just inches from my face. I squeezed the trigger on the bear spray, and a cloud of orange capsaicin hit him in the face. He recoiled with a grunt of fury, shaking his massive head, but it only seemed to enrage him more. That's when the mauling truly began. He pinned me down with one colossal paw, the claws digging deep into my back, and began to bite. I felt a searing, unbelievable pain as his teeth sank into my scalp, tearing the skin away from my skull. I screamed, and he swatted me across the face, the blow throwing my head to the side with enough force to dislocate my jaw. I knew fighting back was useless. My only hope was the one thing everyone tells you to do: play dead. I went completely limp, letting my body go slack, holding my breath for as long as I could. The pain was blinding, a white-hot agony that consumed everything. I could feel him sniffing me, nudging me with his wet nose, his teeth scraping against my skull. He was testing to see if I was still alive. It was the longest, most terrifying moment of my life, lying there, trying not to flinch, praying he would lose interest and leave. It was a battle of will against every instinct screaming at me to fight and flee.
But he didn't leave. Black bears, I learned later, will sometimes cache their food. After a few minutes of mauling me, he seemed to decide I was dead enough. He grabbed the collar of my jacket with his teeth and started to drag me. The feeling of being dragged through the dirt and leaves like a sack of meat by this unstoppable force of nature is a unique kind of horror. He pulled me into a dense thicket, deeper into the woods, and then he started to bury me. He used his paws and snout to push piles of leaves, dirt, and loose branches on top of me. I lay there, half-conscious and in excruciating pain, feeling the weight of the earth piling onto my broken body. I was being buried alive. I could hear him snorting and breathing heavily just a few feet away, arranging his prize for a later meal. I had to lie perfectly still, buried under a shallow grave of his making, listening to the monster that had just tried to kill me, waiting for him to finally leave so I could try to live. He stayed nearby for what felt like an eternity. Every minute I lay there was a new form of torture. I was convinced he could hear my heart beating, that he would realize his mistake and come back to finish the job. Finally, after what must have been over an hour, the sounds of his movements faded into the distance. I waited longer, another 30 minutes at least, before I dared to move. The effort to push myself out from under the debris was the most painful thing I have ever done. I was a wreck. My scalp was peeled back, my shoulder was destroyed, my back was a mess of deep gashes, and I couldn't feel one side of my face. I began to crawl. I crawled for hours, dragging myself back toward the trail, leaving a trail of blood behind me. By some miracle, a pair of hikers found me near dusk. I remember their horrified faces, then nothing until I woke up in a hospital. The physical scars are horrific, but they're nothing compared to the psychological ones. I can no longer find peace in the silence of the woods. Now, it's just an empty space where I know shadows can move and where the indifferent, awesome power of nature can decide in an instant that you are no longer the visitor, but the meal.